Um, okay, Russel Barsh has done so many programs for the San Juan Island Library. Quite frankly, I've lost count. He's talked about bats, he's talked about pollinators, he's talked about wildflowers, he's talked about Coast Salish history, and he will be talking about Coast Salish history again. He's just a great presenter, and I really appreciate both his effort and Kwiat's to be here and give these sort of presentations. So you didn't come for me, you came for Russel, and so at this point we're going to try to see if Russel can share his screen and launch into the program.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Very good. And I think we're ready to begin. Okay, let's dive right in. Well, I thought I'd start with this very iconic picture of the San Juan Islands that was used in some advertising for the islands recently. This is the way people on mainland think about us, and I'd have to say the way many people who live here think about us. And this is the kind of language that I often hear. In fact, it was recently used in some advertising by one of our conservation organizations. It's pristine, it's untouched by human hands, which is very funny in this particular picture, because you might notice in the foreground is some invasive plants that come from Europe and widespread here in the islands. But the point of it is that hardly untouched by human hands, we are the product of a very long history of human occupation and human enjoyment of this landscape, and the evidence is everywhere, from obvious artifacts like this anchor stone, a reef net anchor stone, to the shell middens, the pre-contact rubbish compost heaps of Coast Salish villages that can be seen along our shorelines very easily wherever there's been some erosion or a trail like this one. It's very clear that the islands are littered with evidence of ancient human use. The vegetation is also an indicator, a clue as to the antiquity of human enjoyment of these islands. The distribution of plants like Camas electroni, great camas, the blue flowers in the larger inset photo there, and the Columbia lilies. Very limited distribution, very much tied to where people were gardening and building homes and maintaining a presence in the islands 500 to 5,000 years ago. So our plant communities have the fingerprints of thousands of years of human activity. Our peat cores, the peat that we've been drilling into for our lab in recent years, are another way that the evidence of human antiquity in the islands is recorded. What you can see here is the one section of a 30-foot long, a 10-meter long drill core through peat on Lopez Island that represents a 10,000-year record of vegetation change, climate change, and activity. If you look closely, and I'm going to put a little arrow in here to do it, look closely at that core. That light band that you can see in it is actually tephra ash from the Mount Mazama explosion, eruption, about 7,000 years ago. So this particular section that we're looking at in the photo is about a 7,000-year-old chunk of peat. The inset photos are some of the things that we can extract from peat that give us the story, the human story. One is just a pollen pine pollen and tells us about the vegetation around the wetland. But that little black ball is actually, that's really interesting. That's fly ash from a fire, from a woody fire. It could be from fires heating and cooking in a Coast Salish village nearby thousands of years ago. And so entombed in our wetlands, in the deep recesses of our wetlands, are bits of evidence, clues to change in the landscape and the activities of the humans living here. Of course, as we get closer to the present day, we have the records of the earliest scientists and surveyors, explorers, and photographs that they beginning as the 1850s. C.B.R. Kennerly is a favorite of mine because he was the first professional scientist to explore the islands, to collect animals and plants in the islands, and to take photographs, so that he marks a point at which we could say a baseline for the transition from indigenous Coast Salish world landscape, a Coast Salish landscape, to the beginning of a Euro-American landscape about 160 years ago. Artists at that time, this is a drawing obviously of Mount Young from the Royal Engineers, about 1860. Art from that time also is a very good clue as to how things have changed. And I picked this one with malice aforethought because you can see the open space, the open treeless space on Mount Young in this picture very easily. But if you think about it, the whole thrust of restoration and management on Mount Young has been the restoration of an oak meadow. And if you look closely here, the artist in 1860 did not draw oak trees on this bald, but drew conifers, Doug firs. And so much of what we need to do is to be careful with our inferences about the past when we have such rich evidence of the way things have been and the way they've changed. Perhaps we need to pay more attention to the physical evidence of this as we move forward with plans to try to restore, recover, recreate the landscapes of the past, and bear in mind that there is physical evidence everywhere. We don't have to guess or speculate or theorize. We also have the memories of Coast Salish peoples. I wanted to share this photograph of Grandma Laura Edwards, who was one of my teachers and was really instrumental in my understanding of some of the village life of a century plus years ago. One of the most important things in my learning about this landscape has been spending time with some of the old folks who grew up at least hearing stories about how the landscape was managed in the past, maybe not having had an opportunity to live the life of their great-grandparents, but remembering the stories about how things were taken care of in the past and providing clues as to how that changed the landscape as we see it today. So I'm going to present the evidence, so present the view that I think I've been able to develop of the human design of the island's landscape in three broad areas that I think are critical to understanding the ecology of San Juan County, the San Juan Islands. The first is forestry, forest management, and this is the one that I think gets the least attention in contemporary scholarship and contemporary land management discussion. People were very careful with their forests before Europeans arrived. Forestry was critical to the development of village life and trade, and it's absolutely critical to understand how people's use of forests changed the forest structure forest communities here in the islands before the 1850s and 60s. Cultivation or agriculture, broadly speaking, agriculture, pre-European agriculture, multiple farming systems, multiple ways of producing food and fiber on this landscape before European agriculture changed it again. And finally, wildlife harvesting. For sure, harvesting wildlife on any large scale is going to have a major effect on animal communities and consequently on plant communities and on what the landscape looks like. Well, let's dive in. I'm going to start with forestry again because I think it's been overlooked the most. That big statue on the right of your screen is what in the language of the islands was called a kegan, which is a welcome post or a welcome figure. And every village had at least one out on the beach where you could see it as you approached from the water. It's sort of like the Statue of Liberty as a marker of the welcoming of visitors, of trade, but it also is a little bit like these highway signs that we get used to driving by that say, turn it next right for gas and food. It's an indication that village they can come and visit, eat, feast, trade. And so Gegan, as a huge and monumental art, were the key visual markers of the landscape for Coast Salish people here in the islands, not totem poles, which really don't come from here, but Gegan, figures like this. And they're monumental pieces of cedar, of course, but not the only thing by far that people are building here. The villages themselves were massive constructions of cedar, thousands and thousands of split cedar planks to make a village like this one. This was on the southeast end of Vancouver Island about 150 years ago. And you can see from the scale that these are big houses made of hundreds of large cedar boards. Here's a close-up of a cedar plank house or shed roof house from over here in the islands about the 1870s. And again, you can see it's made up of these rough split cedar boards, hundreds of them, from very large trees, as you could see by comparing the size of the boards to the door on the side of the building. And this was a massive draw on large, old, mature cedar trees in the woods around here in the islands. We best estimate that 12 to 15 villages of this size were in the islands 150 to 200 years ago as Europeans began to dribble in. And so we're talking about maybe 150 to 200 houses of this size standing at any one time. This is another village on Vancouver Island, a photograph also from the same period, mid-19th century. And again, you can see the construction, but think from our ecological perspective tonight about the amount of wood that's represented, the number of trees that it took to build a structure like this. This is not a trivial drawdown of resources. People needed a lot of very, very large cedar trees in the vicinity of good village locations where there was good water, winter food like clam beds, defensive positions. And so the maintenance and protection of mature cedar forests was a critical need of Coast Salish society for thousands of years. This is a great interior view, again, to give you a sense of scale of these kinds of buildings. Painting about 1850 by Paul Kane, who was exploring and sketching here in 1845. So this is an interior, actually this is an Elwha or a slalom village as of about the 1840s, as Paul Kane visited, and you can see something of the height of it, the rafters, a sense of again the sheer size of each individual house, built to house hundreds of people in a village that might have been 1,000 or more people. And I'd also draw your attention to the cubicles that are on the floor, and also to the rafters above. The cubicles were, in fact, made very much the way cubicles in an office today were, with fabric stretched over a wooden frame. And so all of those subdivisions, which divided up the apartments on the floor, are made of textile, they're fabric. And you see bundles of fabric up in the rafters. Keep that in the back of your mind, because this is a hint looking forward that we're going to have to talk about textiles and fabric, because it was an important part of everyday life, not just clothing, but also structures like the interior divisions of human space inside a big house. But let's move on to boats. This is something where we certainly are very aware today of Coast Salish people being water people, being boaters, and traveling in wooden boats. But given the size of the population and the amount of trade, you might step back and think a bit about how much cedar went into boat building, and the provision of the wooden bottoms for thousands of people to be traveling around the islands 2 centuries to several millennia ago. The boating as well, most importantly, from the point of view of understanding its impacts, was under sail. And the sails traditionally used here were themselves made out of plant material, not out of the cotton canvas that Europeans brought with them in the 19th century, but made out of cattail mats, out of huge harvests of cattails, and stitching together cattails with twine made out of nettles, out of retted nettle fiber. And also you see some baskets in there, another kind of textile broadly speaking. So imagine this is a society which not only needs huge amounts of wood to build boats, to build the hulls of boats, but massive amounts of cattails to build, well, this is sort of like the canvas of Coast Salish society: sails, tenting, as you see in this picture, to build temporary structures. And then the basketry, no ceramics, no metal, so basically everything was contained in baskets. And basketry here was primarily cedar bark. So cedar, again, very critical for making baskets, and cedar and cattails provided the cordage, the sails, the temporary traveling structures, lean-tos, tents, and such that people used in a regional trading system. So that, again, if we think in material terms and ecological terms, Coast Salish society here in the islands and the surrounding mainland required a tremendous amount of particular materials that they had found ways of using to build homes and villages, to build boats and sails and temporary shelters like tents, and to build the containers that everything was carried and cooked in. To summarize, Western red cedar, our local cedar, absolutely central to the entire society. And not just any cedar, not any little pole, but big trees, big enough for the hull of a boat, or to split those enormous rails that were used, big boards that we used to build houses. Doug fir, which was a target for European or Euro-American logging later it continues to be a target for forestry, was used, but used for cooking. It was used for tinder and for fuel. And so in a Coast Salish community, the important thing was protecting mature cedar, having lots of big old trees, taking care of them, using them sparingly, making sure that you got more cedar growing, and thinking, well, gosh, I mean, imagine it. A big red cedar, a big cedar tree, big enough to build a boat, is hundreds of years old. So people had to be doing forestry, thinking on a time scale of centuries, of millennia. Currently, we have a turnover in forestry of like 25 to 50 years that we think is a mature forest and it's ready to cut down because it's dug fir or pine. And people here were thinking in terms of a mature forest ready to begin to selectively harvest in 500 years, generations longer. Also, I note here in this outline just some of the other things that, when you think about it, really required some management because of the scale of the use that was required by a large materialistic society. Nettles, for example, for making twine, for making marine cordage. There were whole villages, whole regions, particularly over at in the delta of the Skagit River, like at Fur Island, hundreds of acres of nettles that people maintained and harvested regularly in order to make marine cordage. Cattails, acres and acres of cattails here in the islands that had to be harvested routinely in order to make this, what I call Coast Salish canvas, which is the cattail mats, and so on. So people were not just cutting a tree now and then. They were harvesting on a very large scale, and in a way that's a different, it's a different algorithm, if I could put it that way, than contemporary logging, which is aiming mostly at Douglas fir and maybe secondarily in some places at pine. Cedar, not much. In fact, it was seen as a trash tree during the logging booms out here in the 19th century. And so we have this fast turnover logging now of Doug fir, when it was preceded by a logging concept in which old cedar forests were the valuable forests that you took care of, protected, maintained, treasured, because cedar was the fundamental source of all of the major structures that made up everyday life. That gets us to an issue of fire, which is a management tool I would argue is quite controversial today. Fire was used to do underbrush clearing here. There were lots of oral accounts, both accounts in Coast Salish languages and family traditions here, but also by early explorers and early scientists. Lots of accounts of people setting fires to clear out underbrush, like the fire in this image, which is over in the Northern Territory of Australia, and is a very similar concept of light, flashy fires that clear away the underbrush. They suppress underbrush, they suppress shrubbery, but they don't burn the trees. When Europeans began to manage forests here in the islands, they did this. They either cut or burned the trees. This is a totally different way of managing a forest, where instead of using fire to clean out the underbrush, you use fire either to remove the remaining wood after you've logged everything out, or to remove the wood, to burn the wood, which is what we're doing with most of our so-called restoration projects now, is we're burning down the trees. None of that has any authenticity in terms of traditional forest management. And the trees that get burned are very often the cedars, which are the trees that Coast Salish people would have done everything possible to save. So we've got a completely different relationship with forests now, that creates a completely different landscape. And I mentioned too that one of the things that we need to consider too is that a Coast Salish village logged the land around the village. You couldn't move a tree very much. It was hard to cut a tree down with stone tools primarily, stone tools and the use of fire cordage. But with the advent of mechanical tools like this is the original kind of motor saw. This is the chainsaw of the early 20th century. With motor equipment and in a global market transport of logs, people start to mine trees instead of taking the ones they need now for their own use. They cut trees down and they sell them to other people. And so logging changed from being a craft for providing the wood for houses and boats and basketry here in the islands to an export industry. And of course, much of the logging that was done in the islands in the late 19th century was for fuel for the lime kilns, and basically was feeding the growth of Seattle rather than the maintenance of villages and homes here in the islands. Anyway, let's move on to another view of this, from forestry to cultivation to agriculture. And I'm going to start with the least familiar version of this in the Coast Salish world, which is not agriculture as we think of it, as a garden or a farm on dry land, but modifying shorelines in order to produce food from the intertidal zone, something that has been in stories, in Coast Salish stories forever, but was only very recently validated by archaeology and thus accepted as not having just been a story, just been legend. So most of this is around something that is now being called clam gardens. Broadly speaking, that's correct, because one of the things you grow in this kind of an environment is clams. It's building substrates that are ideal for large-scale production of shellfish in the substrate, like the little neck clams, the little hard shell clams that are shown here. Take a look at the picture, and you can see the jetty, and I'm going to go and put in a couple of arrows to mark it out. There it is. That's a pre-contact structure. It's an artificial jetty built out of rocks to create a strip of salt marsh that lies between it and the beach. That's a clam garden. Here's another view, a really, really nice aerial photo of one nearby. This is in Georgia Strait. And you can see very clearly the rock jetty, the rock wall, and then this kind of shallow intertidal salt marsh in between the jetty and the beach. This is something that was actually understood, or it was seen, but not appreciated, I guess I would put it, even by early explorers. Here's one of the older pictures I have, and that's a clam garden. In fact, it's one of the artificial substrates that was constructed by Coast Salish people and a clam digging party about 125 years ago. And here's another view from that period. But one of the things that fascinates me is that this was not just creating a substrate that that clams would thrive in and that was easy to dig so that people could harvest it regularly, basically cultivating clams as you would cultivating plants. It also was about cultivating plants, because lots of plant species that were valued by Coast Salish people as food prefer to grow on a shoreline and are salt tolerant, so that they are competitively more adapted to a salty shoreline than a freshwater wetland. A couple that were in great demand historically among Coast Salish people, among indigenous people, were cinquefoil, the strawberry relative, and um, Trifolium scilly, or springbank clover, which is a true clover. They both produce masses of rhizomes that are tasty and were the steamed bean sprouts, if I could describe them that way. They were the bean sprouts of Coast Salish cuisine, and widely used in huge quantities as vegetable matter to go with all the other things, the fish and shellfish that were the protein staples of the Coast Salish diet. So clam gardens produced clams, but they also produced the vegetables that you ate with the clams that really didn't grow very well in other environments, very patchily, but you could create extensive gardens to grow your salt-tolerant vegetables along the shoreline. So now let's move up from the shoreline to the dry fields, the meadows. That's something that our lab has been really focusing a lot of our attention on, not only on camas, but on the other edibles that people tended to grow with camas in the same kinds of managed and indeed constructed habitats. And I guess that's my point, is that like a clam garden, dryland gardens built by Coast Salish peoples over the last few thousand years were constructed habitats that changed the landscape in fundamental ways, the clues to which, the fingerprints of which we can see today. Digging skelligs. And I'm going to introduce some Coast Salish words here. Now that you're into this, we're going to talk a little Northern Straits. Skelligs, the digging stick, is emblematic in Coast Salish traditional culture of the relationship of people to farming, people as farmers rather than just as fishers. And you might note that the farmer here is wearing Coast Salish canvas. It's cattail mat clothing, overalls made out of cattail mat. The gardens here were rock walled, more for marking than for preventing the movement of people or animals. And that's a similarity to Polynesia that's very striking, of marking out the different family plots, different management units of a large gardened area with simple rock walls. And these were described having been on the south end of San Juan, for example, and on Stewart Island extensively even in the 1860s. But European farmers, sheep herders, took most of them out as far as we can tell. So rock-walled gardens, cultivation in the traditional sense of breaking up the soil, digging, and what was it all about? Mostly in terms of staple food, about camas, about Camassia linni, or quolachel in the Northern Straits language. As a staple, it's a delightful one. It's something that we've been working on for some time as a possible reintroduced or rejuvenated food in the islands, because it grows with no added water, it's salt tolerant, it's drought tolerant, very, very well adapted to our landscape. Here's some raw bulbs, some cut, cleaned bulbs that have had the tops and the tails taken off, the tops and the roots. And then at the bottom is a bunch of partly caramelized, long cooked, very, very sweet bulbs ready to eat. And the thing that made camas both so popular and nutritious was that with long, slow, moist cooking over a few days in a pit oven, And obviously, we don't use a pit oven over here. We use an Instapot or a crock pot, but it works the same way to break down the inulin, that's the storage molecule for the polysaccharide that camas stores its energy in, to break it down into fructose. So you start out with a bulb that is basically inedible and end up, after cooking, with something that is gently sweet, and I think has best been compared to sweet potato. But that's not all people grew in their gardens. They grew chocolate lily, jaliku, as in the language here, and Columbia lilies, which were incredibly popular and don't require any special cooking to break them. They can be stir-fried, and simple, or Indian carrot, our little native carrot, which is a member of the carrot family, and cleaned and just raw like European carrots, is sweet and resinous and quite delicious. And the kind of things, just a sampling of things that we have records of having been part of a gardening culture. So more comparable to Polynesian ecology and economy than to what most people think of as Native American or North American economy. It's certainly not hunting and gathering. It is very much place-based management, long-term, of cultivated ground, which would change soils, the hydrology. Of course, it requires that you keep areas open, so you're suppressing the return of woody vegetation. You're keeping things open and building soils that are far, far richer in nutrients than the soils would be if they were just allowed to continue to accumulate underneath a tree canopy, or in an open meadow, in an open herbaceous but uncultivated meadow. Now comes the best part, it seems to me, is that like Europeans and any other civilizations in the world, Coast Salish peoples had livestock, except their livestock, although it was primarily for fiber, the way sheep have been in the more recent history of the islands, the so-called woolly dogs that were raised in huge flocks of hundreds by Coast Salish people were, strictly speaking, for textiles. So this was the basis of the textile production that I hinted at when we were looking at Coast Salish houses. Lots of good historical evidence on the technology of this. Here's a painting by Paul Kane, again from the 1840s, of a traditional, and leaving a rug or carpet on it, and a more recent Curtis photo from the 1890s of casting off with a hand wound spindle. This is something very central to Coast Salish identity, very much important culturally, but consider also the ecology of having flocks of dogs. That's, if we're thinking about impacts and the way in which Coast Salish society interacted with its environment, a flock of traditionally 200 dogs, which would be a good flock for a weaver to have, is an enormous protein drain. Only a society that could produce enormous surpluses of food, including food that dogs can eat, protein like fish, salmon. Only a society like that could possibly maintain a textile industry based on dog flocks. And the dogs had to be places that people used small islands. They used corrals in villages. The dogs were a very large part of the biomass that Coast Salish society maintained in this landscape, primarily by feeding them, by sharing fish with them, which then in turn means that this society had to manage its relationship with salmon and fishing very carefully, because it was it needed to produce far more fish than humans could eat because of the dogs. Textiles, again, very much central to the distinctive identity of Coast Salish peoples, both as clothing, which was something the earliest explorers in the 1790s noted. People were going around in woolen clothing, not the same design as Europeans, but the Europeans were wearing woolens, and so were the Coast Salish people they met, but also in beautiful, beautiful rugs and carpets that served the function of carpets in Western Asian society as a source of wealth, as something you could store wealth in, that you could transfer wealth through the gifting of beautiful carpets. And so rugs or carpets, blankets, like the one pictured here, were a critical part of the high-end economy, of the economy of feasting and building relationships. Trade agreements and trade treaties were all lubricated by the transfer of these fabulous woolens made from dogs, and it's a good basis for a good foundation for understanding how it was that when Europeans did settle here in the islands and the surrounding mainland around the Salish Sea, that Coast Salish people, particularly Coast Salish women, easily within a generation moved into the role of being the seamstresses, milliners, the producers of most of the custom tailored clothing that Europeans of the late 19th and early 20th century wore here in the islands. As one of the old folks that I talk to put it, is to say that all of the nice white ladies of the Victorian era here in the islands had their dresses made for them. They were clothed by nice Indian ladies who were the producers of clothing in the early post-contact period, much as they had been the producers of clothing in the pre-contact period. So if we put this thing, so this is an agricultural system with shoreline farming, so cultivation, the creation of clam and salt-tolerant vegetable gardens along shorelines, which involves building reefs and jetties and changing shorelines, actually extending shorelines. This is what's so interesting about it. Today we worry about eroding shorelines, and this is a practice that actually buffers shorelines with living salt marshes that extends the land out into the water and builds an artificial intermediate zone that's full of shellfish and salt-tolerant plants. Very, very interesting, different shoreline management vision than anything that we have today. Then the gardens on dry land, fenced, but most importantly, maintained clear and open. People took the woody, suppressed woody regrowth, and they also, in fact, suppressed grasses because they were, like any gardener, they were pulling the grass out and replacing it with crops, with plants that you eat and don't eat grass. So expanded herbaceous meadowlands that were filled with plants like camas and chocolate lily rather than grasses was part of the garden economy. And finally, the dogs, well, wherever you had dogs, you had to import marine protein in the form of fish, fresh or dry, and you ended up with the dogs fertilizing everything to it. So a flock of 200 dogs has a totally different impact on the landscape than a flock of 200 sheep. The sheep eat grass and they recycle it in sheep poop. Dogs would be eating fish and recycling fish by pooping on the land. And it's I would say we're only at the beginning of appreciating how much extensive dog herding would have affected the nutrient balances and the plant communities in the parts of San Juan County that were maintained as dog pounds or small dog islands. It's a very interesting the area for some further investigation of the impact of huge flocks of dogs. And the one way of thinking about it is to reflect on what came next, which was huge flocks of sheep in the late 19th and early 20th century, and just petering out now, really, or to some extent being revived. Sheep are grass eaters, and when European shepherds arrived here 140 years ago, they didn't find much grass because Coast Salish people were gardening and pulling all the grass up. So Europeans brought grass with them and planted grass everywhere here in the islands, so there would be something for their sheep to eat. So just as Coast Salish people were converting potential grasslands into flower meadows, Europeans came and then were converting flower meadows back into grass, which is one reason why an ecologist like me, an historic ecologist who looks at this in the long term, is appalled by the idea that the whole point of landscape restoration should be to grow more grass. That's very European. I think grass is what we need in our natural areas rather than wildflowers and in fact gardens. So think about that. Sheep are very much associated with our grass centrism now. Just briefly, since salmon and wildlife is so much part of our sense of what indigenous culture was about, let me point out a couple of things about wildlife harvesting that I think fit this story and underscore the scale of the impact of human activity on the islands in pre-contact times. So salmon, many contemporary Coast Salish leaders like this this phrase, people of the salmon, and certainly salmon was a very large part of what people produced and ate, although it was still probably no more than 30% or so of what they were eating. Salmon were produced on an industrial scale. That's the way I would like to frame it. They produced obviously not with a hook and line, but produced by the millions because of the fact that they could be dried and traded. They could be used consequently as part of a trade system to other things you needed, also because of the dogs. So you had to produce about twice as much salmon as people needed. As a result of the extent to which salmon could be harvested on an industrial scale, people here developed technologies that caught salmon by the millions rather than by the dozens, like the river weirs shown here. This is a weir that was down on the Puyallup River over San Diego. There were all larger rivers on the mainland had weirs like this, most of them stretching all the way across and opened and closed with curtains of sticks woven together so that they could be essentially closed so that fish would get stuck on one side or the other where you could net them out. And so this was a very simple way of catching huge numbers of salmon. But take a look at this. I mean, first of all, this is not a simple construction. This took a lot of work and a lot of wood to build a weir like this. And because of the nature of our river flooding, spring floods, particularly in the days when there wasn't a lot of work being done to pull deadheads or logs out of the rivers, it's very likely that these things had to be rebuilt every year. So a huge amount of labor to build a structure that could catch salmon by the thousands, the tens of thousands or more in the different rivers. And this itself meant a significant amount of modification of the rivers and their flow and structure. But here in the islands, we had a totally different way of doing it. And most of you are probably already familiar with at some level, which is our reef net, reef net gear. This is the Stewart Island gear, the Chevalier gear in 1940. But of course, this goes back much further. Archaeologically, this technology is about 2,500 to 3,000 years old. There's evidence on Lopez Island of 3,000-year-old shifting from using hook and line and hand nets to using reef nets like this. And the important basic the structure of it is a net slung down below the boats in a strategic location that adult salmon migrate through, so that in a sense you are trapping them along a migration path. The net, which is clearer in this picture, can be pulled up after the fish have passed into it. You braille out the dip out or hook out the fish that you want. You let everything else go. So it's also extremely selective. You have no negative bycatch for fish that die because you have caught them, but you're going to throw them away. So selective, also very low energy, because while it takes a lot of energy in terms of human labor to build reef net gear and nets, it doesn't go to the fish. Strategic doesn't have to be moved the way we do move boats around now. The cool thing is that I love to point out is that reef net anchors, which held them in place for whole seasons and then were re-anchored from year to year at the same place, dropping more anchor stones year after year, eventually build up anchor stone piles. This is a photograph, an underwater photo from the University of Washington's old research boat, Centennial, when it was still stationed in Friday Harbor. And Dave Duggins and I shot this film off of the south end of Lopez in an anchor stone pile from a reef net that was operated until the 1970s. And what we were delighted by was to see that rockfish had moved into the anchor stone pile, and we had never seen so many rockfish in one place. It was an enormous Swiss cheese, a sea rockfish. So one of the interesting things is a beautiful example in terms of habitat modification, that that reef net fishing, while it takes a lot of salmon out of the system, builds habitat for rockfish, which people also ate. So assuming that people took care of salmon habitat to keep the salmon going, they were also, by their technology of removing salmon to eat here in the islands, building habitat that increased the populations of rockfish. And that's something, I don't think that people necessarily figured that all out and planned it that way. But over time, they hit a solution that they stuck with for 2,000-3,000 years, that modified the ocean floor by adding structure that created fish-producing habitat that wasn't there before, and habitat that produced fish that people also benefited from. So like the clam gardens, this was a modification. This was not just living with what was there. It wasn't just natural. It wasn't natural. It was building something that wasn't naturally there, but which worked with the existing ecosystem to add structure, species, value, ultimately more food for people over the long term. And that's something that we still benefit to some extent from. Unfortunately, rockfish have been largely fished out, though that's another story. I work on copper rockfish, which are doing quite well, and we may need to revisit the regulations that we have on rockfish management. But my my point here is that the abundance of rockfish 50 to 100 years ago, when there was a big rockfish fishery, and that was what people ate in the winter here in the islands, was an artifact of salmon fishing rather than just a natural phenomenon. Folks, it's fascinating to me. I used the same kinds of nets made out of willow or ash root and nettle twine and cedar bark, and hung them up on poles and caught birds too. So reef netting had sort of a reverse side, which was putting nets up in the air along our wetland shores, like certainly up between some of the smaller islands on the north end of San Juan, over at Pole Pass on Orcas, down by the Watmel Bight on Lopez, and netted sea ducks as they flew in and out of wetlands along the shoreline. So that again, even seabirds were harvested on an industrial scale by the thousands, requiring that people be very careful and know what they were doing to be able to get away with that for centuries or thousands of years. If you look at now our present day fishery, and this is a picture of Richardson over on Lopez Island, where I live, back in the 1930s. We have wildlife harvesting that is dependent on the burning of fossil fuels. And we are not only over harvesting many of our native marine animals, but we're doing it at the cost of climate change. And that's a very serious difference in the way in which we are interacting with wildlife, from a world in which people harvesting wildlife in ways often actually increased wildlife habitat, to harvesting wildlife, chasing it around, burning fossil fuels, affecting the climate, and also potentially having other impacts on the ecosystem in which we're fishing. So I think that's something that we probably should also revisit and understand better, how a change in the way we harvest wildlife has some unanticipated and unintended effects, like climate change. Well, let me finish with just a few thoughts about this in a larger social context. People who were this technologically sophisticated and wealthy and productive, understandably, were connected with each other through family and trade networks that extended far beyond the islands. I find today there's a tendency to just think that one or two so-called tribes lived in the islands, or maybe they didn't live here at all. I know I recently found that at least some high school students in the county are being taught that Indians never lived here. They lived on the mainland. They just came here to fish. Well, not only are there a lot of villages here, but also a great deal of interconnection. This is a map that I put together for the Orcas Island Historical Society Museum just a few years ago, that shows the major language groups that intersected here in the islands. Red ellipses are the approximate areas within which those languages were spoken, and the villages and reef net sites are marked, reef net sites in red and villages in black. And I can make a full size high definition version of this available for distribution or for display as a poster. The point of it is that people were not isolated from each other. They had sailing ships. They produced large food surpluses, and they lived in big villages, big permanent villages that were connected by marriage and by trade alliances that extended throughout the entire central Salish Sea and connected places that are now separated by an international border. That was a world in which early European settlers were much more likely than they were elsewhere in North America to simply marry in and become part of the Coast Salish continuum than to try to put Coast Salish people on reservations and not let your daughter marry one. That's something that's very special about the islands that we should not forget. That because the islands were a center of trade and commerce, and we were rich in pre-contact technologies and production when Europeans first began to settle here, Europeans chose extensively to become part of Coast Salish families, and Coast Salish families integrated with European settlers economically, socially, kinship-wise, to a greater degree here than we currently seem to acknowledge. This is the whole vision of it. This is the graduation photo at Stewart Island School in 1912, and it's half families that then and now regard themselves as Coast Salish families, but all living together and going to school together. And that was a reality that preceded all of the conflicts between tribal fishing, for example, fishermen and islanders here in the last 50 years. The reality was that everyone was the same, that people were marrying, having kids, sending their kids to school together, and it went further. A lot of the people that we treat as the pioneers of San Juan County were not pioneers. They were, if I can be excused for the moment to say this, they were the Indians, and people of mixed ancestry that had very clear Coast Salish visions and worked with their neighbors and were part of building the socioeconomic landscape that we have today. And just a few examples: our first ferry captain in the San Juan Islands, our first ferry captain, Sam Barlow, who was famous in Puget Sound and Seattle and up here, was Coast Salish from a Lopez family. Henry Caillou, who was one of our first county commissioners and served on the county council for decades, built one of the first salmon canneries and one of the first lumber mills on Orcas Island, and self-identified as Coast Salish, and also was instrumental in the shipyards on Decatur Island, which were running in the teens and 20s. And when the islands were part of Jefferson County, we were part of Putnam County for a while, part of Jefferson County, our state senator was Coast Salish, William Bishop, and was also the Speaker of the Washington State Senate in the 1920s. In fact, one of the great ironies of our, I would say, a short-sighted view of history is that there were more Native Americans serving in the Washington State legislature in 1920 than there are today in 2020. And most of them came from the islands. So where I would like to leave you on all of this is, I think that we've been marked, if I could say that, the islands have been marked by not just some songs and stories, as it were, of the people who were here before, but the people that were here before, number one, transformed our landscapes in profound ways, like modifying shorelines, changing plant communities by gardening and using fire to suppress woody regrowth, and logging selectively and completely differently than we've logged now for 140, 150 years. But they also affected who we are sociologically and culturally and economically in ways that we no longer acknowledge. This was more of an integrated and syncretic society as it moved from Coast Salish technology into the economy of logging and sheep at the end of the 19th century. And a lot of our key industries, even in the post-contact world, fishing and logging and milling and boat building and ferries, and were actually run by our Coast Salish families for 50 or more years. And so the challenge now, I think, is for us to be more conscious, but also more specific about what we value in the islands in terms of some of our landscapes. In fact, remember back to Mount Young and the bald of that mountain. And was that natural? Or was that there because people did something up there? And the American camp and the gardens, the evidence of old gardens there. So much that we value and see as either a natural dimension of the islands or as something that we have brought to the islands as part of the, can I say, the Americanization of the San Juan Islands in the last 150, 160 years, is actually part of our indigenous inheritance. And our indigenous family, a lot of them are still here. And I would wish that we spent a little more time working together, building an appreciation, but also taking care of these things, taking care of these places. So let me leave you with some acknowledgments of all the people, and no, only a tiny fraction of the people who helped teach me all of what I think I know about this, and have a chance to hear from you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Russell. I really appreciate it. Wow, that was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And not only that, but the questions in the chat box are really, really piling up here. So I'm going to weigh in on this and ask you first one. And that is that somebody asked, what was the name of the welcome figures or posts at the villages?
Okay, the word for it in the Northern Straits language spoken here traditionally is gegen. So there's a gegen. And it just specifically refers to the
Russell, you went you went mute on me. Can anybody else hear him? No.
It does appear that we're having some technical difficulties with Russell right now. The good news is that we got through his really thorough presentation. So what we can do is we can take down some notes of the questions, have Russell respond, and we can email them all to you and his answers. Thank you all for being so flexible with island internet.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize for starting late and all the technical difficulties, and I'll definitely pass on all these thanks that you're sending to Russell in the chat box. And we'll, like Lisa said, we'll try to record a lot of your questions and see if he can get back to us that way. So thank you again for joining. Really appreciate it.